Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances on the eastern section of the front line. The Russians have expanded their foothold across the Serbets River line in the eastern section of the front line. The Russians have also managed to advance further in the direction of Toretsk, started the fighting over the fortified positions on the outskirts of the city. The Russians advanced further on the western flank of Pokrovsk, in the northern flank of Kurakhove towards Andriivka, and in the western flank of Velika Novosilka. The Russians continued their offensive operations all across the front line, including in the Kursk region. However, there is no developments over the past 24 hours in that direction. The Russians have managed to advance here to the west of Velika Novosilka towards Novosilka itself, where they are fighting along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of the road in and out of Andriivka from the western direction, as Russians continue offensive operations aiming towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of Velika Novosilka. A direct assault would be from the low ground towards the high ground against fortified positions the Ukrainians have available. It is a frontline position with several firing positions and trenches, and then there's a rear position with additional firing positions and trenches. It is a two-part defensive line northwest of Velika Novosilka. The Russians have the eastern flank exposed for the Ukrainians here on the direction of Novy Komar with the full control over the settlement. The Russians will be able to cross over the river line and start attacking from the eastern direction. However, the Russians are likely looking to gain control over Novosilka and Vilnopole to then attack from the western direction at the same time, putting the Ukrainians in a pincer maneuver from the western and eastern directions, gain full control over the fortified positions, and bypassing the settlements of Neskushne, Vremivka, and Velika Novosilka. Some Russian sources have claimed that Neskushne is already under Russian control. However, I have seen no evidence of such developments. The Russians continued offensive operations here in the Velika Novosilka direction, and in the northern flank of Kurakhove, the Russians have managed to advance further towards Andriivka, almost reaching the outskirts of the settlement, fighting over the fortified positions just outside of it. As the Russians continued offensive operations here, they also managed to advance north of Slovianka, aligning the front line along Ukrainka to the north, with Slovianka in the south, in a general assault towards the main highway between Pokrovsk and Andriivka, where the Russians are here launching offensive operations towards Yasenove along the highway towards Andriivka. They are attacking from the eastern direction from Slovianka and the area between Ukrainka and Slovianka, and they're also advancing along the fortified positions north of Andriivka and east of Andriivka, all in a general assault towards the settlement of Andriivka. Andriivka itself may seem large, but it's just a few roads with houses. It is a suburb area, not a urban area with high-rise apartment complexes and industrial areas. It is only normal houses, normal buildings. However, there is a large defensive network of Ukrainian fortified positions in the northern parts of the settlement. This is a very significant defense when faced from the southern direction. However, the Russians are attacking from the eastern and northern direction, which is the weaknesses of this fortified line. If the Russians gain control of it, then the Ukrainians would have a very difficult time defending settlements such as Ulakli, Dashne, Konstantinopel, and Rusliv, as they will be exposed with no fortified positions to rely on. The defensive line of the Ukrainians here north of Andriivka spans into the Dnipropetrovsk region and no further, which means we're now seeing a push by the Russian forces into the Dnipro region with the push along the defensive line north of Andriivka and along the Vovche River line here in the Donetsk region. The Russians here would be looking to flank the Ukrainian positions near Velika Novosilka and enter the Dnipro region, cutting off some of the highways between Pokrovsk and Zaporizhia and allowing them to advance further along less fortified areas outside of the Donetsk region, where the area between settlements grows larger, the frequency of defensive lines grows smaller, and the terrain grows flatter, and industrial areas are practically non-existent. This means that the pace of Russian advances could go significantly up into the Dnipro region if they manage to reach it through the fortified lines of the Ukrainians. Bypassing these fortified lines will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, and with the fighting over Pokrovsk as well, redirecting a lot of the Ukrainian resources for the defense of the city, the Ukrainians would not be able to properly defend every single section of the front line in a proper manner, where areas where there are hardly any fortified positions, such as the Dnipro region, would need a lot more manpower and vehicles to properly deal with the Russian forces, because they would be defending from weaker positions with no geographical, entrenched, or other advantages that are present within the Donetsk region. In the western parts of Pokrovsk, the Russians have advanced further west of Solone. Following the capture of the settlements, the Russians continued offensive operations along the highway, not towards it, to gain control over the fortified positions, and advance along the Solone River to the Dnipropetrovsk region, where they've managed to capture settlements such as Novovasilivka, as now Solone as well as Volkova. As they push in the western direction, they also push in the northern direction from the north of Volkova towards Kotlina. However, there is heavy fighting taking place over the fortified positions, where the Ukrainians are able to withstand Russian assaults with the advantages of the fortified positions present and proper manning of the defensive positions. The current Russian army is within firing range of Pokrovsk with a lot of their weaponry, such as FPV drones, artillery, MLRS strikes, and so on, where they are constantly shooting at the Ukrainian positions here in the southern flank of Pokrovsk. And this is actually a very interesting perspective. We see, if we take a look at Pokrovsk and have Pokrovsk at the center, if we take a look at the area to the south of Pokrovsk, separated by the railway to the western side and the eastern side, we see that there are a dozen Ukrainian villages. There are several layers of defensive positions and fortifications prepared. There is Mirnorod to the eastern direction. However, if we take a look at the northern flank, we see that there are a lot fewer settlements. There's not as many fortified positions. We see that most of the settlements are along river lines, such as the one to the northwest, where other areas such as the highway, the area between the two highways, are largely empty. This shows exactly what I am referring to when the Russians enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region. We will see a lot more of the north of Pokrovsk rather than the south of Pokrovsk. In a sense, the western parts of the Donetsk region, all the way to Andriivka and the outskirts between Kharkiv and Dnipro, compared to the eastern parts of the Donetsk region, we see that there's a significant difference in terms of fortifications, industrial areas, and density of settlements. This means that going forward, once the Russians capture Pokrovsk, the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians would be significantly weakened. In a sense, the battle over Pokrovsk is very important for the Ukrainians, because not only will it limit the supplies going in and out of the Donetsk region from the western direction and expanding the supply lines of the Ukrainians, but it will also require a lot more Ukrainian soldiers and equipment to defend the following areas, because there are simply less fortifications and less defensible positions. And this problem is simply worse in the southern parts of the Kharkiv region, in the entire Dnipro region, and in the Poltava direction, all the way up to Kiev. There's practically nothing between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. If the Russians make a breakthrough here in the western direction, the Ukrainians would have a difficult time stabilizing the situation again. And that is why the Ukrainians are sending all of their available forces to the front line, whether it is their offensive operations in the Kursk region or in the defensive operations in the eastern and southern section of the front line, where the objective is simply to prevent the Russians from making a breakthrough, no matter the cost. Because the cost at that point would be lower than a Russian breakthrough. In the Toretsk direction, the Russians have managed to reach the northern outskirts of the settlement and capture the first fortified positions of the Ukrainians. With this advance, the Russians have started the fighting over the fortified positions on the western outskirts of Toretsk, gaining control of which would allow the Russians to gain control over Shcherbinivka and the pocket of the Ukrainian forces to the east of Shcherbinivka, which is in a very difficult position now because their own supply lines are vulnerable due to the Russian positions here in Shcherbinivka and in the northern parts of Toretsk. The Russians can simply attack the Ukrainian forces during their movement through the one road which is practically unopposed, and that is east of Cherbenivka. The Russians, with their close proximity, can launch mortar strikes, FPV drones, artillery, and potentially direct fire from tanks and other vehicles on these Ukrainian forces, meaning that the supply is extremely limited, and a direct assault by the Russian forces towards Cherbenivka or through the fortified positions to gain control over those would completely cut off the Ukrainian forces in that pocket south of Toretsk. So this could be another encirclement of Ukrainian forces in these past weeks. In the direction of the Serbets river line, the Russians have managed to advance further in the direction of Andriivka, where they are expanding their foothold north of the forest patch. Here they are looking to expand their zone of control on the western bank of the Serbets river line and to generally develop offensive operations on the defensive lines of the Ukrainians north of Liman, gaining control over which will allow the Russians to make a push towards the Oskar river line, whether through Zeleny Doline and the settlements along the main roads, or directly across the fields through the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. Reaching the Oskar river line will cut off the Porova section of the front line from the Liman section of the front line, which would isolate yet another section of the eastern bank of the Oskar river line for the Ukrainian forces between a river line in the east and a river line in the west. And a point I made early on in this war is that the Russians always aim to achieve a half moon, and that is when the Russian forces attack a position and siege a position, what they like to do is to gain a front line on 3 fronts. That means that the area of the Ukrainian forces here east of Kupiansk is reflected on as a circle, where the Russian forces are practically a Pac-Man ready to eat this circle, and the objective of the Russian forces is to be able to attack Ukrainian positions from 3 separate directions and creating a pocket as small as possible for the Ukrainian forces to be concentrated. This means 1 artillery shot in the center would inflict more casualties on the Ukrainian forces than any of the Ukrainian artillery being shot to either direction, because the Russians would be able to spread out their forces a lot more because they're attacking on a much wider angle, while the Ukrainians are limited to the area in which they operate from on the eastern parts of the Oskar river line. If the Russians are able to create more of these, then the Ukrainian casualties here on the eastern bank of the Oskar river line will significantly increase. That is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.